What is a pharaoh?
At first glance, this question seems to be so simple that even a child would be capable of answering it.
The pharaohs were the kings of ancient Egypt. However, what did it mean to be a king at a time? The roles of the Queen of England, Charlemagne, Romulus were completely different, even though they all carried the title of king. Well, let's start with one of the funniest hobbies out there: etymology. The word used by Egyptians to define king was Nizut Biti, which can be translated as the Lord of the Reed and the Bee, symbols of Lower and Upper Egypt. Sometimes the term was abbreviated simply as Nizut. Another very used title was Hameth, often translated as His Majesty, although the more correct translation would be His Person. This term, unlike Nizut, was used to indicate the individual behind the crown. We can already see that the idea that a king had two personalities, the mortal individual and the eternal king, an idea very popular in the Middle Ages, already existed in the time of the pyramids. Those who watch my videos may have noticed that I avoid using the term pharaoh, because, to most people's surprise, it was almost not used. This word appears the first time in the Bible, which explains its popularity, and it is very likely that it came from the Egyptian word Pharaoh, which means big house, and was used to designate the royal palace. And in the same way that the American government is sometimes called simply as the White House, or the French government as the Élysée, sometimes the Egyptians used this term to refer to their rulers. However, historians still debate when the word pharaoh was used to refer to the king as an individual. Some claim that it was during the New Kingdom, others on the Third Intermediate Period. Other words very often used are Jiti, Lord, derivation of the word Jit, Father, Reka, Power, and finally we could use the expression Neger Nefer, Perfect God. Now you know how to call an Egyptian king. But what if you wanted to become one? What was needed? First, you had to be a man. Of course, there were some exceptions, the most famous being Hatshepsut, but they were very rare and often justified by periods of regency or political chaos. One of the main responsibilities of a king was to be the protector of the kingdom, and although women had the same rights as men, Egyptian society was still patriarchal, and war was the exclusive domain of men. Second, you had to be the only one with the title of king. According to Egyptian ideology, it was impossible that two kings could coexist, and even though in certain times of crisis that happened, Egyptian historical documents still try to hide this unpleasant reality. Finally, you had to have a divine nature. The Nizuts reigned thanks to the will of the gods. They were the children of Ra, the only ones who could interact directly with the gods. If priests existed, it was because a king could not be in all the temples at the same time. This idea will evolve over time. But before we talk about it, let's take a look at the alleged divine nature of kings. Many think that the Egyptians believed that their kings were literally living gods, and it is easy to understand from where this assumption came from. Egyptian texts describe Ramesses II being able to control the elements, and others said that anyone who touches a king without permission will be burned on the spot. But there was a root difference between kings and gods: mortality. Again, we have to come back to one aspect that seemed very strange for us, but was very common at the time. The king is two persons on one, the divine part and the mortal one. It was only after death that a king could become a full god, and it was for this that many temples were built in honor of powerful and popular monarchs. Of course, as always, there were some exceptions, like Ramesses II, who was deified alive. But again, they are very rare. During the rise of Egypt and the Old Kingdom, the king was the center of everything and everyone. Indeed, the words queen, prince, and princess did not exist. The royal family was defined as son of the king, daughter of the king, and great royal wife. Only the Nizut held divine and temporal power, and he was the only one who could grant his servants access to the realm of the dead. But with time, the situation changed. Nomarchs, the rulers of domains, began to get more and more independent. At the same time, the cult of the god Osiris gained much popularity, and his cult defended the idea that each one was solely responsible for his entry into eternity. The king was still important, but his role had become simply symbolic, which gave way to the first intermediate period, a time when Egypt was broken in a series of small independent states, often in war. After a century of confusion, the 11th dynasty succeeded in reuniting Egypt under its control. However, to avoid making the same mistakes as its ancestors, this new dynasty decided to share their power with a few trusted members, the viziers. Each half of Egypt had a vizier, whose responsibility was to apply the king's will and keep balance between nomarchs and priests. These reforms were extremely beneficial, and Egypt enjoyed many centuries of peace and prosperity. However, this new golden age was not eternal, and the two kingdoms were invaded by mysterious people only known as the Hyksos, who took control of the north, starting the second intermediate period. Instead of imposing the culture, the Hyksos tried to adopt that of the Egyptians. Their leader took the title of king and tried to impose himself as legitimate Nizut. However, in the town of Wazet, a resistance took form, and after 2 centuries, a new dynasty took control of the two lands. It was during this period that a god would gain much popularity and influence: Ammon, the hidden god. On Samanidiri, he would become the patron of the conquerors of Wazet, becoming the most powerful god in Egypt. After the expulsion of the Hyksos, Egypt would enter a period known as the New Kingdom, its most militant and glorious time. The Nizuts became lords of the world's greatest nation, and they pushed its borders to to the distant kingdoms of Babylonia. However, without these riches coming, the clergy of Ammon gained more and more influence and began to compete with the power of kings. This is why the famous Akhenaton created a religious reform where he followed the example of the kings of old and placed himself as the only one who could interact directly with the divine. And to make it clear, contrary to popular belief, Akhenaton did not invent monotheism. The Aten cult favored a single deity and limited the influence of other cults, but it never asserted that the other gods did not exist. Sadly for him, his reign was extremely unpopular, and his religious reforms were quickly forgotten, although its impacts on Egyptian art and philosophy were profound. The cult of Ammon continued to gain influence, but powerful kings like Horemheb and Ramses II were capable to keep a delicate balance. Alas, after the death of Ramses III, his heirs were unable to impose themselves, and Egypt entered a new period of crisis, where the pharaoh became a symbolic figure, and the real power resided in the hands of the clergy of Ammon. Never again the pharaohs were able to recover their former glory. Egypt was invaded and conquered by many peoples: the Kushite, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Macedonians, and finally the Romans. However, the image of the pharaohs did not die. All these new conquerors were represented under the model of the old lords of Egypt, and it was only with the arrival of Christianity that the dream of the kings finally ended.
Or did they? It is true that today no one claims the title of Pharaoh or Niso outside some religious groups, but even if those words have no political power, they still rule over our imagination.
As I said before, any child is able to recognize the word Pharaoh. They are present in movies, books, music, games and dreams. The image of a man wearing the double crown and a false beard is as iconic today as ever before. In the end, we can see that the Egyptians managed to achieve what they wanted the most: eternity.